Last week, a masked man assassinated the CEO of UnitedHealthcare in the middle of the streets of Manhattan. Now authorities are alleging that the individual responsible, the assassin, was a 26-year-old Ivy League graduate named Luigi Mangione. They caught him in Altoona, Pennsylvania, in possession of what they say is the murder weapon and a short manifesto. We'll be talking about the ideological progression behind this assassination attempt, trying to divine some of the lessons, and whether or not it suggests a new dark phase in left-wing American politics. Plus, we'll be talking about Elon Musk's Doge, the so-called woke right, and Trump's deportation plan. All that and more in this week's podcast. The most significant story in this week's news cycle was, without a doubt, the spectacular assassination of the UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson and the subsequent capture of his alleged assassin, a young, handsome, well-educated person named Luigi Mangione, who authorities say was in possession of a weapon and a manifesto outlining a possible motive for the crime. The assassination itself, which unfolded last week, was engineered for maximum spectacle, and in fact, it was captured on a CCTV camera, and these images rocketed across the country and across the world. This was a spectacular assassination because the target was the CEO of a major corporation. The execution was brazen. The assassin, who wore a mask and a hood, patiently approached the CEO as he was exiting a hotel on the streets of Manhattan, and then at close range with kind of cold calculation, pulled the trigger multiple times until he was dead. On the scene, police found shells of the bullets etched with phrases, deny, defend, depose, indicating a deliberate preparation. So this was a cold-blooded killing, as well as an ideological motivation. There was resentment, anger, and hatred because of UnitedHealthcare and supposedly because of its policies. This week, there was another layer that added to this story that made it even more of a media feeding frenzy. The suspect and the alleged assassin was revealed as a young man named Luigi Mangione, who had all the outward trappings of success. This was an individual who comes from a very wealthy family in the Baltimore area. He's handsome by appearance, physically fit. He appears to be highly intelligent from the trail of social media posts that he left. And he had 2 degrees, which he earned in quick succession from University of Pennsylvania, part of the Ivy League. And so you had these 2 seemingly incongruous images or stories suddenly collapsing into one another. And it led to this great question: why? Why would someone who, in theory, has everything in life, looking ahead in his life, everything is looking up, and yet he succumbed to this very dark assassination? He orchestrated it carefully, he attempted to escape, and then he was caught in a very marginal position, huddled in a McDonald's in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. And so I think it's important to take this seriously at 2 levels. The first level, of course, is trying to trace the ideological progression of Luigi Mangione from the details that we've discovered in the news media to try to understand both his stated rationale, but then also perhaps the underlying psychological motivation behind this crime. And secondarily, I think it's important to see this crime, which has set off a media feeding frenzy. You have lookalike contests, you have people idealizing and even idolizing this individual. You have even popular politicians such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren trying to harvest some of this energy that has been unleashed by this revenge killing into their political program, their left-wing economic program, while, of course, carefully creating some deniability, some distance between themselves and the actual crime of murder. First, let's look at the question of motive. Motive is, of course, a key element in any criminal investigation, but in a political crime, which this, by all accounts, appears to be, it's even more important. Mangione was, like many of us who have elite education, who grew up at least part of our lives with the internet, we leave a trail of posts, of engagement, of comments, of interactions as part of our digital life, and he was no exception. He left a trail of clues, a trail of statements, a trail of bits of information on the social media platform X, on the publication platform Substack, and on the reader-sharing application Goodreads. And look, is this a total revelation of all of his thoughts, feelings, motivations, problems? No. But it does give us some information to start piecing together. And what strikes me is that his ideological development, you can look at it over the last few years by tracing his readings, his statements, his interests. And a few years ago, and the left-wing press has really focused on this as the source of his kind of ideological transgressions or resentments. It started with what I could think of as an elite centrist ideologies. He was sharing content from Yuval Noah Harari, who is the kind of World Economic Forum guru, who thinks that human beings are rats that have to be guided through the maze of the modern world, and that we can someday overcome our own nature. He was sharing content from the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who has captured, in a substantive way, some of the professional class anxieties about technology, about youth behavior, and with other colleagues around natalism and birth rates, which were also a focus of Mangione's a couple of years ago. And then third, you have sharing content and discussing content from the Stanford scientist and health guru Andrew Huberman. I think of him as like the cold tank protocol. All of these small lifestyle adjustments and healthcare protocols and supplement routines that in theory take the human being to another level of performance. So again, reducing human nature to its biological nature. You can make these incremental improvements, you could take these supplements, you could sit in an ice bath for an hour and you'll be 12% more effective. These are banal elite ideologies. That's not to say that there's no truth to any of them. There are certainly some insights that are worth garnering. But what all these have in common is a popularity and a safety in elite circles. You can follow Harari, you can follow Haidt, you can follow Huberman. You're signaling perhaps some dissidence from establishment, the kind of left liberal establishment, but you're well within the confines of elite ideologies that are reducible, I think this is important, to a scientific and quantifiable base. This is almost a kind of McKinsey-style ideology, which is, again, ties in very much to the world of elite Ivy Leagues. But beginning perhaps 2 years ago, certainly a year ago, and then accelerating in recent months, you saw a change in his consumption, a change in his discussion. He moved from banal elite ideologies to what I think of as banal radical ideologies. He wrote a review of the Unabomber's manifesto that was quite positive. I think he gave it 4 stars on Goodreads and felt sympathy with some of the more radical ideas, some of the rationalizations for violence that were in Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. He also bought into a left-wing corporate greed narrative. This is a standard narrative over the past 100 years in American life that is mobilized on the left, especially in times of economic uncertainty, that has the populist component. It explains misery, misfortune, ill health because of corporate greed, corporate corruption, corporate malfeasance. It provides a great target upon which to project one's own miseries. And he also was talking about kind of new age radical ideologies in the form of psychedelics. And so if you've been around, say, kind of tech centrists or Silicon Valley, New York, Seattle, there's a subculture that has adopted psychedelics not as a countercultural phenomenon like it might have been in the late 1960s, but as a way to unlock creativity, insight, productivity, the kind of Steve Jobsification of psychedelics that are then not only deemed acceptable in these professional environments, but deemed a kind of substitute for a grounded religious life. You can go to a shaman in South America, slurp a cup of ayahuasca, and then unlock your brain, which can then be used to demystify the world. You can find your authentic self, and then you could exit the kind of trappings or the drudgeries of the modern capitalist society. And so you're watching this arc of transformation, and simultaneously some of the personal tidbits start to stack up. This is an individual who went through what appears to be a very painful back surgery. There was published reports saying that he may have lost his job at a tech firm where he was working as an engineer. And then he was living, at least for a time, at a kind of commune environment in Hawaii, a kind of new age, professional class, affluent communities. And look, these are features of some places around the world. You have them, of course, in some boroughs of New York. You have them in places like Berkeley, California, places like some of the more secluded places in Hawaii. And there is the potential, although it's not totally confirmed, that this kind of narrative of personal struggle, personal pain, personal unhappiness because of his medical condition, in the context of someone who was very healthy, very strong, very physically fit, he was an athlete, at least in high school, could have led him to snap. And so we have the personal progression layered onto the ideological progression, but whatever combination of these happened, what's certain is that he did snap. Because someone who is well can see the folly in murdering someone on the streets in cold blood. Someone who is unwell can rationalize that action, which is exactly what he did. But we have even another more important layer that we can peel back. In two places, when the police caught him in Altoona, Pennsylvania, he had an alleged manifesto, a few hundred words, and then a spiral-bound notebook with specific notes that are alleged to be part of the planning of this crime. And this is where it becomes very interesting, because the more specific that we get about the actual crime, the more it dovetails and mimics the narrative structure of radical left-wing ideologies, and as I'll argue, radical left-wing nihilism. At the beginning of the supposedly handwritten manifesto, he says some boilerplate leftist lines that we have the most expensive healthcare country in the world, and yet the 42nd longest life expectancy. In other words, we're not getting the value that we're putting into it. And the critical question is then why? And he provides an answer. He denounces, quote, the corruption and greed in the industry. He denounces their quest for, quote, profit. And in the other notebook, he said he wanted to murder the CEO of this largest health insurance company that at the annual parasitic bean counter convention. So we can break down each of those words. Parasitic is, of course, a left-wing trope. Capitalist parasites extracting the labor of the working class, or in this case, insurance company parasites extracting from the pain of struggling Americans. And then he calls it a bean counter convention. Of course, the CEO was trained as an accountant, and the insult here is that you can't put a price on health, on human beings, on goodness, but that's exactly what these capitalist parasites do, and therefore they deserve to be eliminated because they don't have an appreciation for life. They merely monetize it and convert it into death. And so what's interesting about this manifesto is two things. One is that for a very smart person, he's reduced it to very simplistic left-wing narratives. And it was only a few hundred words. He didn't even actually think through why he was committing the crime in detail. In fact, he says at one point, quote, "I do not pretend to be the most qualified person to lay out the full argument about the corruption of America's healthcare system." And yet he felt he was educated enough to plot and execute a plan to murder this company's CEO. So beneath this admittedly surface-level left-wing rhetoric, what is really happening here? It's something that I have witnessed the last few years and documented in various capacities, but really comes into sharp focus here. It's a form of left-wing nihilism. So typically the left likes to present itself as left-wing progressivism. We're going to make the world better. We're going to provide more health care. We're going to get a public option. We're going to have the Affordable Care Act. We're going to have a single-payer system that will provide care and value each human being. That's the narrative in a kind of traditional left-wing progressivism. But once that wears off, certainly the failure of Obamacare contributes to this. Certainly the failure of the Sanders-Warren wing of the party has contributed to this. As those narratives have been sloughed off and abandoned as impractical or, more accurately, as counterproductive, you see a new form of left-wing nihilism, which is really the other side of the coin of left-wing progressivism. If we can't build a better healthcare system, let's destroy the existing healthcare system, and perhaps out of this catastrophic destruction, something better will emerge. And the reason for this is quite simple. If you look at it from the outside honestly, building a society and building a national healthcare system for 340 million people is hard. Assassinating an unsuspecting individual on the streets of Manhattan is relatively easy. And so the energy gets directed into that direction because the energy seeks opportunity, and then whatever psychopathology that is living inside these individuals, and certainly Luigi Mangione had some psychopathology living inside of him, can then use those narratives as a intellectual rationalization. He's a smart person. He was seeking some rationale for what is likely a complex mix of ideological and personal reasons why he wanted to commit this crime. The big problem with this, of course, is obviously the murder. You should not murder people for no reason in the streets of Manhattan. This is obvious, although not as obvious as it should be. Some people are really struggling with that. But the second problem, and I think the deeper problem, is that it reveals the extent to which madness and nihilism have been baked into our culture. Someone who is an Ivy League graduate, someone who has a strong family network, someone who has wealth and health and opportunity ahead of him, decides to go down this dark path. That's why there's fascination about this case. If it was an unknown, anonymous, vagrant who stabbed someone in the street, it's a blip. But we've raised the stakes because what this shows, and of course for those of us in the media who share the same kind of, let's say, educational background as this individual, as both of these individuals, it creates this window that America's elite is simultaneously failing to restrain the kind of psychopathologies of too many young people, and that the elite ideologies, both the elite ideologies that are more conventional and elite ideologies that are even more radical, offer no path of constructive action. And in fact, they are preying on people that for their own reasons are feeling a sense of rage, a sense of destructiveness, a sense of passion. It gives them the keys and the language to act out on that in highly symbolic ways, but nonetheless extremely destructive ways. And there's a cynical element to this as well, because those political actors on the left, while saying, I condemn violence, violence is bad, murder is not okay, kind of perfunctory caveat, they're saying, well, maybe he had a point. Maybe the insurance executive had it coming. Maybe our healthcare system is broken. And so what they're doing is they're harvesting psychopathology. They're harvesting seemingly random acts of violence, and they're using them as ammunition for their own political campaigns. They're using the kind of spectacle, this bloodthirsty spectacle, committed by a handsome, well-educated, intelligent young man, in order to advance progressivism on the back of nihilism. Second, beyond the individual dynamics, what does this case represent as a whole? I think it represents a unique historical transition in our time from historical idealistic leftism to a historical nihilistic leftism. And what I mean by that is really important. We've seen, especially this past few months, what I think of as the exhaustion of the BLM mass movement. BLM as a particular mass movement is finished. We saw that with the Daniel Penny verdict in New York this week. But what happens after the splintering, the self-devouring, and the self-destruction of left-wing mass movements is that they splinter into a multiplicity of fringe movements, and fringe movements even at the level of one individual. We saw this in the 1960s and 1970s. You had mass movements, rioting, Black Power movements, coming out of the civil rights movement. You had college-educated leftists and the anti-war movement. You know, they protested, they organized, they created intellectual material, they proposed concrete policy solutions, some of which were okay, many of which were not great. But they tried to use mass movements, of course, with some violence inherent into that, to project, at least at that 1964-1965 stage, some positive agenda, the Great Society agenda, the civil rights agenda. By the early 1970s, that movement had been exhausted and then splintered into radical factions, many of which were very affluent, highly educated, white radicals, the Weather Underground, and then the ethno-radicals, the Black Liberation Army, the Black Panther Party. And they realized that, as Herbert Marcuse said, the counter-revolution had succeeded. Nixon was really wiping the slate clean. Those movements had exhausted themselves. They switched to individual acts of spectacular violence, assassinations, kidnappings, bombings, under this theory that they could trigger a change in consciousness through spectacular individual acts of nihilistic violence. They could create a utopia through concrete acts of destruction. We're seeing that same dynamic now. We saw it with Luigi Mangione this week, but we also saw it, and this is the second most important incident, with Aaron Bushnell, whom you've probably already forgotten, who was the individual who lit himself on fire, who self-immolated, supposedly in support of the Hamas campaign against Israel. Or, as he would perhaps say it, and others around them would say it, is against the international Zionist movement with complicity and participation of the United States. And so you have the two different spectacles. You have self-immolation and assassination. Violence against the self, violence against others. But what they share is that they're both symbolic. They're both individual acts of desperation designed to reverberate symbolically through the discourse and designed to elicit concrete political changes. But the great irony is that this desperate nihilistic lashing out has led to nothing and will likely lead to nothing in the future. Aaron Bushnell became a cleanup job, melted on the street in Washington, D.C. Luigi Mangione has become an insurance claim and a legal process. He's become more paperwork, both in the public and the private sphere. And of course, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare has already been replaced, and that healthcare system will continue to function much as it did the week prior. This is the nihilistic element. one can actually predict that this is true, and yet they engage in these acts anyway, which are destructive towards themselves and, of course, to others. And we're seeing this historical progression from mass movements to splinter movements to radical symbolic acts of violence. We should prepare for this to continue into the future. And I think as the Trump administration begins, it should take these kinds of acts seriously and devote law enforcement resources towards preventing and disrupting them from occurring in the future. Because all of these things happen within networks. They all happen with digital communications. And they all have left some kind of paper trail. And as in the 1970s, when the Nixon administration was able to disrupt much of the left-wing nihilism of that era, we should do the same in this era. We should be on guard for this, both at the tactical level, and those of us who are in the discourse, who are embedded in elite circles, should also provide a bulwark against it at the level of philosophy, at the level of commentary, and the level of politics. Because this is not just a left and right question. This is a nihilism versus civilization question. And we should be welcoming, especially those people on the center left, who could have guided someone like Luigi Mangione in a perhaps left-wing, maybe perhaps a right-wing direction, but in either case a substantive direction, and prevent someone like that from going into this other dark abyss. And I think that the actual tragedy of this, because it is a tragedy for, of course, the family of Brian Thompson, but it's also a tragedy for Luigi Mangione, is that he actually had the capacity, the intelligence, the connections to actually make a difference in an admittedly troubled healthcare system. But rather than study the problem and do the substantive work toward fixing it, rather than taking responsibility for himself and then trying to create a constructive action for others, he took the easy way out. He took the despicable way out. And it's something that should never happen again. Now let's tackle three headlines that were in the news, things that caught my eye this week that we should talk about. The first is this. The publication Vox, which is a horrific publication, all things considered, did publish something that was at least worth discussing. Their opinion discarded, but the substance of the matter is worth discussing. A friend of mine and a kind of permanent gadfly on the discourse, and I mean that in all the right ways, James Lindsay hoaxed the Christian publication American Reformer into publishing what was a kind of doctored and inverted version of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, switching out the communist terms for what Lindsay and others have called Christian nationalist terms. And he submitted this under a fake name. He got it published, and it was kind of blew up in the face of the guys over at American Reformer, many of whom I know and I consider friends. The purpose of this hoax, though, was to expose what Lindsay has been calling the woke right. This idea that there is a horseshoe and that the woke left has an equivalent counterpart that he's calling the woke right, that they share some characteristics. Seth Dillon, of course, from the Babylon Bee, kind of jumped into this discourse, and his argument was that movements that are based on grievance, identity, and oppression are inherently woke. That's what defines woke, and therefore Christian nationalists, post-liberals, Groypers, and the other assorted right-wing movements can be accurately termed part of the woke right. Well, first I'll put my cards out. I totally disagree with that. I think that it's actually not accurate and it's not helpful in a practical sense. Grievance, identity, and oppression are universal concepts. I made the argument that the Founding Fathers made a list of grievances in the Declaration, posited a new American identity, and that complained, using this exact term, about the oppression of the British Crown. And so I asked, are they woke? And there was a lot of hemming and hawing and paper shuffling. And they doubled down, though. And there was one commentator, I believe also with the Babylon Bee, who said, actually, yes, they were woke, and Hitler himself was part of the woke right. And so I think that for me was the moment where we've just gone so far beyond. Black Lives Matter Christian right in America and Hitler are all part of the same definition. They can all be reduced to something called wokeness. It's like, no, that's philosophically wrong, historically wrong, linguistically wrong. There's so much wrong with it. If you can put all of those people in the same bucket, your bucket becomes meaningless. And what I think the problem is that woke right is used as a smear word, what linguists would call a floating signifier, a kind of hazy word that has a lot of connotation, but very little accurate denotation. And my real problem is that it obfuscates or conceals or confuses more than it reveals. The thing about language is that you want words that get to the truth of the matter, that reveal some insight into the matter, that make distinctions, that distinguish between two things or three things or an infinite number of things to capture the one thing that it truly is. I don't think it does that. In fact, I think that it is inaccurate, and it lumps in all of these various right-wing movements, many of which I disagree with, and then attempts to use it as a cudgel against what is perceived as a threat to the center-left, center-right liberalism. There's also a practical problem in that it creates a false equivalency between the woke left, which is real, and the so-called woke right, which is real but has a kind of 2 orders of magnitude less power, influence, and elite position than its counterpart on the left. And it muddies the rhetorical power of the word woke. Right at the moment where we have a second Trump administration, where we want to be fighting against woke in the administration, in Congress, we're now muddying the waters. I think that this is very bad tactics. And I think that you could oppose, for example, right-wing racialism without creating this great muddying, which I think is counterproductive. Next, we're going to talk about Doge, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, and it will face a recalcitrant bureaucracy. There was an op-ed piece in Market Watch this week that I thought had some important details about this. And it was basically an article from 2 longtime government, academic, bureaucrat types outlining the reasons why Doge is likely to fail. And the historical analysis was actually helpful. It basically said, look, we've tried this commission in post-World War II. We've tried this commission structure under Reagan with the Grace Commission. We tried this kind of commission structure with Vice President Al Gore, who was supposedly going to reinvent government, while his president, Bill Clinton, was declaring the era of big government to be over. And they've always failed for X, Y, and Z reasons. And that limiting waste, fraud, and abuse is something that people promise, but is actually hard administratively to make good on. There's a lot of truth to this, and it's something I'm going to be covering throughout the next few months because I think it's an important initiative that is facing these very real obstacles. And the other reason is that the math is just hard. Entitlements, of course, military spending, interest payments on the debt are the vast majority of expenditures. And history is really littered with attempts to reform these programs. And President Trump himself has said we're not going to touch those sectors of the budget, which is going to make this that much more difficult. But if you read this piece, what's really interesting is that there is a point at the end, reading who wrote this, what is their affiliation, And one of the authors was actually like a McKinsey consultant, and then the chair of California's High-Speed Rail Authority, or the former chair. And this is amazing because it's like the perfect example of why these things always fail. This person, who should be hiding in shame. The California High-Speed Rail Initiative, of course, is probably the biggest boondoggle in American history, with the possible exception of the F-35. And yet, has does not have the shame which would prevent a person from saying, I've failed in these ways. We can't build the train. We wasted billions, and this is why it's hard. But actually, this person is just kind of arguing with Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy because of the opposite politics. But I think inadvertently revealing the reason for this. The bureaucracy is staffed with people just like the author of this op-ed, which is why, in fact, this person is right. It will be very difficult for Musk and Ramaswamy to make progress. And finally, Headline from Reuters, Trump says he'll use the military for deportations. So what's important about this is that we're already gearing up for the big fight. Trump won the election on immigration, but the implementation of his policy vision entails real risks and real danger for his administration and therefore for the country and for the success of his political movement. You're already seeing that the left is kind of seeding the narrative. And the narrative is quite simple, is that Trump is going to revert to fascist authoritarianism and deploy the military to, evict your grandma, your gardener, and the people who are essential for, buying housing, reducing the cost of labor, and delivering the goods around the U.S. And of course, you're going to see these narratives increase actually as he takes office. And I think that this is something to pay attention to because, look, on the face of it, of course, the National Guard should be deployed to deal with a national security issue like the border. This is common sense. I don't think actually anyone would oppose this. Send 10,000 National Guard troops down to the border. Use them to seal it off, use them to provide humanitarian assistance, and use them to return illegal migrants back across the border into Mexico. That's like a no-brainer. We should have been doing that this whole time. Trump should do that as well. But with the question of deportation, I think that there is a two-pronged strategy that he should really consider, and I'll be fleshing this also out in future pieces. You need to have a strong hand and an invisible hand, and you need to actually work with those simultaneously. The strong hand is military, law enforcement, uniformed men with big guns smashing down doors. But that should be directed exclusively and most aggressively towards MS-13, towards the cartels, towards the human traffickers, towards the Mexican gangs, the norteños, the sureños, and others as you go down through Central America. Trump should use, strong military force against what is, in effect, a military adversary within the United States itself. And I think that the public, if you're seeing headlines and images and stories about Trump using federal law enforcement and even military assets to disrupt, cartel infiltration, cartel crime, and the militarized cartel activities within the United States, that's going to be very favorable. He's going to win that fight on public opinion. It's going to solve the actual problem, kicking the cartels out of the country, at least diminishing their effectiveness with which they can operate, and then creating the possibility for a secondary process, one that should be done with an invisible hand. And by this, I mean remigration. And so, look, Biden administrations and previous administrations have let in what is estimated to be tens of millions of illegal immigrants, most of whom, in some cases, should go home. That cannot be done at gunpoint. It really can't. And I know conservatives are talking a big game as they're going to be tough, they're going to deploy the military, et cetera. That is a losing gambit. He's going to lose the fight in the press, he's going to lose the fight in popular opinion, he's going to lose the fight in the courts, and ultimately going to lose the fight because you can't do that effectively at scale. And so the invisible hand method is really just about shifting incentives related to foreign policy, related to the governments of Mexico and Central America and other countries. Shifting the incentives at the border by projecting force to prevent new entries, of course, and then shifting the legal, financial, and administrative codes by which our society operates in a decentralized manner to encourage voluntary remigration. And so strict penalties for employers, rules around banking and deposits, rules around deputizing local law enforcement to do to do checks on different premises as part of traffic stops, et cetera. And to create what is, in effect, a method of reorganizing the incentives that will stop and then reverse the flow of migration. I think that's the only way that it could succeed. But I think that it is also most successfully implemented as part of this two-handed strategy. You have the public, the private, the hard and the soft, the visible and the invisible. And by bringing those two strategies together, I think that the Trump administration can be successful. And finally, let's dig into the comments section. I wrote a piece earlier this week about the Daniel Penny verdict in New York City, in which Daniel Penny was, of course, found not guilty of negligence and manslaughter, and in which I argued that the BLM era was over. That sparked a number of dissents, including this one from Substack. Christopher's right to say that this is an opportunity to right the course. I first felt it at Trump's Bronx rally, all colors coming together to cheer for common sense values. But Christopher leaps too far in claiming this marks the end or even the decline of the restorative justice era. There continues to be zero consequences for these malicious prosecutions, not a single instance nationwide. I'm as optimistic now as Christopher, but he can't reasonably say that the tide is already changing until at least one of these bad actors suffers a cost. BLM suffering tarnish on its brand is not an inflection point. I think that's wrong for a number of reasons. And I'll first say that I'm not saying that the era of leftism is over or that the era of left-wing racialism is over. These are permanent embedded features in American life, dating back decades and centuries. But what I am saying is that the particular moment, the last 10 years, 2014, 2024, BLM as a particular expression is over. The organization is in shambles. The arguments are not treated seriously. The media narratives that they're trying to mount are failing, even at places like the New York Times. And that even after what would be a rallying moment for their street movement, such as the not guilty verdict of Daniel Penny, they can't get people out into the streets anywhere. The energy has dissipated. And elites, including left-wing elites, or let's say at least center-left elites, left-liberal elites, are increasingly distancing themselves and feeling ashamed of the narratives and the policies and the outcomes that have been thus far associated with BLM. And that's not to say that there will be no malicious prosecutions in the future. There might be, but those are increasingly localized, and there is an increasingly large penalty for those, and voters are increasingly going to reject those kind of policies at the ballot box. And so I think that it is an inflection point. It's an important moment for the United States because the Penny verdict, and look, there was pressure, protest pressure, media pressure, BLM pressure on those jurors in a very left-wing jurisdiction, with a very left-wing judge administering the proceedings. And yet they had the courage to actually say, fear is not going to override our commitment to the rule of law, and we're going to do the right thing. That wasn't true a number of years ago. Which brings us to the second comment and dissent. Another reader says, okay, great, Penny found not guilty. Now what can be done to help Chauvin, the policeman who is now in prison for murder? Please give the path to correct such an injustice that has been perpetrated on him. And of course, this is about Derek Chauvin, who was at the scene and was the man who restrained George Floyd, who later died, in my view, from a combination of stress and a drug overdose, so-called excited delirium, because he had, loaded with fentanyl and other drugs in his system. And nonetheless, the police officer who had pinned him to the ground and restrained him was found guilty of murder, and his appeal on the state murder charge has been exhausted. The United States Supreme Court refused to hear it. And look, there's no going backwards. Derek Chauvin is finished. He's going to serve a term in prison. This is unjust. I don't think he should serve a term in prison. I don't think he was guilty of murder. But I don't think that invalidates the basic point. And in fact, I think it strengthens it. What happened to Chauvin could have easily happened to Daniel Penny a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, certainly 4 years ago. But this time it didn't. And the initial injustice of the Chauvin case remains. It's a stain on our proceedings. It's a stain on the country and its culture. And the craven moment where many people were so scared to tell the truth or to implement impartial justice that they caved to that mob, they caved to that narrative, they caved to that movement. We're not there anymore. And so this is the tragic nature of history, the tragic nature of justice, which is always imperfect. Chauvin was made the great scapegoat of the George Floyd era. And there was this uncomfortable moment, if we're going to be totally honest, in 2020 and 2021, where left and right agreed we're willing to sacrifice this person. You had conservative politicians, mourning the death of George Floyd, calling for justice, calling for Derek Chauvin to be put on trial, calling for him to be guilty as charged. There was a sense in that moment that if we only sacrifice this individual, the nightmare would pass. But the lesson of that moment, in retrospect, and the lesson of that moment, frankly, that we understood, some of us at that time, was that creating that sacrifice will not appease the left, it will feed the left. And in fact, the jurors in the Daniel Penny case got it exactly right. We're just going to do the right thing and hope that the culture is in a place where that becomes possible, where the intimidation becomes less intense, and hopefully we could emerge on the other side from the national nightmare of the BLM era. I hope that's what happened this week. I hope that my dissenters are wrong, and I hope that our country can move forward.